So let's get started with domain enumeration. As we discussed earlier, as soon as we get a a launch pad or a foothold machine in a domain, what we can do if we follow our attack life cycle or attack methodology, which we have discussed earlier, what we can do is to enumerate the current domain and the trusts, etc., to map various entities, relationships between those entities, what are the privileges for different users, objects, and groups, what are the ACLs, and other interesting stuff in the domain. Enumeration is often an overlooked part of an attack lifecycle, but it is one of the, if not the most important, then it is one of the most important part of any attack. We should, in a real world assessment, spend a lot of time in enumeration, especially more so in the domain enumeration part. As we will see, there are many interesting uh, and simple attack paths which can be discovered by extensive enumeration. Now, how do we enumerate a domain with built-in tools? We can use net.exe as we saw earlier, or WMI classes to do that. We can also use .NET classes with that. For example, if we run this particular code on a PowerShell session, what it does, it uses the directory services.activeDirectory.domain class and then its static method get current domain to uh, get the name or get the details of the current domain of which our machine is a part of. Now, one thing which you may like to keep in mind is we are using this in PowerShell so that we can always avoid touching disk on our foothold machine as long as possible, or on any machine where we have our access persistent. But this can also be used in, let's say, in C Sharp or any other .NET language. So feel free to use .NET based binaries or C Sharp based binaries for anything which we discuss in the course. So let's run this particular command on a PowerShell session. So I'm copying this and let's run this here. On this machine, we do not have any special privileges. Uh, no elevated privileges, but we can still enumerate interesting information with the help of built-in tools. So what do we have here? We can enumerate the following from these using this .NET class. We are part of a forest called moneycorp.local. Our current domain is a child domain called $corp.moneycorp.local. There is just one domain controller for our current domain, which is called dcorp-dc. The domain mode level, that is the functional level for the current domain, is 7, which is Windows 2016. Quite evident from the domain name, but our forest is, our parent is moneycorp.local. So we are connected to the root node or the forest root domain called moneycorp.local, and we are just one level below the forest root. Now we can spend a lot of time uh, in discovering different .NET classes. For example, in the directory services.active directory, we will find a lot of classes which can be used to enumerate the domain. We can spend a lot of time exploring those domains, those classes. We can use LDAP search queries, or we can use some ready-to-use tools to speed things up. And that is what we are going to do now. We are going to use PowerView, which is an open source PowerShell script, very useful for enumerating domain. Or we can also use the Active Directory PowerShell module. The Active Directory PowerShell module is a Microsoft signed module. It is Microsoft's module. This is the same module which you get when you install RSET and the Active Directory role on any server. Now, there is a general misconception or a general knowledge base that the Active Directory module can be used only if you have the RSET installed, the remote administration tools installed, and if you have local administrator privileges. Uh, Actually, it is possible to use the module without having RSET or without having administrative privileges. In fact, if you have a look at this GitHub repository which is maintained by me, you can actually load the module from a download execute cradle the same way you can use, let's say, PowerView or any other PowerShell script. This particular repository, we also have the same tool on the student machines as well. This particular repository has a simple copy of the valid module from a server 2016 box where AD role was, or the Active Directory domain controller role was enabled, right? So feel free to copy your own DLL and module from any machine where the Active Directory role is installed and the module is available, right? So with this, once again, what we will do is we will use PowerView and parallelly the Active Directory PowerShell module, because there are some benefits of using this. Actually, there are pros and cons. PowerView, because it is written specifically for, or was written specifically for red teamers or for penetration testers, it provides some functions which are very useful directly, and a handful of them I have not ported or I have not tried with the Active Directory module, right? The Microsoft module as well. But for basic and some intrusive enumeration, the Active Directory module excels in some areas. For example, it works perfectly fine from a PowerShell constrained language mode, right? It adheres to the constrained language mode. So if you find yourself in a constrained language mode, you can still enumerate the domain with the help of the Microsoft module. Also, because it is Microsoft signed, chances of its detection are really low compared to the PowerView, right? With this knowledge, let's get started. So we can do domain enumeration with PowerView and the Active Directory module. This is the way the slides are written. The font which looks in a bolder font, this one, get net domain, this is from PowerView. This is the Lucida console font, which looks darker. The lighter one, which is the Courier font, that would be for the Active Directory module. So this is the convention we are going to follow in all the slides. If there is something in the Lucida console font, that is for PowerView. Something which is in the Courier new font, that is the Active Directory module. Right, so let's get started. Here we are going to load the PowerView. You may like to note a couple of things here. The CAD directory is exempted from the purview of Windows Defender. So your tools, for example, PowerView, would not be detected onto the disk, but sometimes when you load the script, it may get detected. So in that case, it is the anti-malware scan interface, or MZ, which blocks the script after it is loaded, right? So in that case, we need to bypass MZ. So okay, and in this case, it was not blocked because probably I already bypassed MZ here. The command which we are going to use to bypass MZ is shared later on in the class. So when you are trying this stuff, you can use that particular command. Here, let's come back to the domain enumeration. Let's run getnet domain. So what we have here, if you compare the result of this thing with result of using this .NET class, it is quite similar. So if you actually go through the source code of PowerView, it uses a lot of .NET classes in the background, a lot of LDAP searches, right? It is a huge script. So if you have time and if you want to modify it for some stuff, make sure that you read its source code, right? It is written very in a very well to read. It is a very well to read code. So make sure that you read it if you want to modify it. So coming back to this, once again, we get the same information. Let's start another PowerShell session. Let me increase the font size a bit. So in this particular session, we are going to use the AD module. Right? We can simply use import module and the Microsoft signed DLL, which loads all the required functions. For example, get AD domain is loaded now. But it always makes sense, especially if you are running this module from an interactive session like this, it always makes sense to load the PSD1, that is the module, as well along with the DLL, because in some cases, some properties of an object may not be visible, at least may not be visible in a very good readable format without this PSD1 loaded. So now we have the Microsoft Sign module loaded. Let's run get AD domain to get information about the current domain. So as you can see here, we are using the Microsoft module for enumerating the domain. We do not have administrative privileges, or we do not have the RSet installed, right? So we can see the similar information. This is a bit more verbose than getnet domain, right? Our parent, our forest is moneycorp.local. Domain mode is Windows 2016. We have a child domain which we'll come back to in a moment. Net bias name of our domain is dcorp. It's $corp. Our current domain is $corp. And we have just one domain controller, dcorp DC, which we saw there as well. Now, we can also get object of another domain. Later on, when we will discuss enumerating trusts between within a forest or across forests, we'll get to know that there is an implicit trust between a parent and child. But we'll discuss that later on. Right now, we can see that it is possible both for PowerView and the Active Directory module to list information from another domain where we have enough permissions or where we have the trust to do so, right? So we can actually extract information from another trusted domain, or where we have enough privileges or permissions to do so. Once again, in a parent-child relationship, we can always do what we are doing here, right? We can enumerate the parent domain from the child domain, as we can see here. Now we can extract much more information. For example, if you would like to extract the domain SID, which is used frequently in later attacks, it's get domain SID. So let's run this from PowerView, get domain SID. So this is the SID, or the identifier of our current domain, which was visible here as well. When we run get AD domain, we can see that this is the domain SID, right? Now similarly, we can extract much more information. For example, if you would like to have a look at the domain policy for the current domain, this is the PowerView command you can use. So let's run get. Here you can see that I'm deliberately sitting in the AD module master directories so that we can easily figure out which session has which function loaded or which module loaded. This one has the Active Directory module loaded, and this one has the PowerView module loaded. So get domain policy. Let's run this. Get domain policy. So we have these different policies. Let's run the system access one, right? So this is the policy for our current machine. This is the default domain policy, not for our current machine, right? Now we can always have a look at the Kerberos policy. So this is useful to enumerate the password policy here. This is useful for the Kerberos policy. You may like to notice that later on, when we discuss attacks like golden ticket, it makes sense to enumerate the Kerberos policy before creating a golden ticket. Why? For example, you may like to keep the maximum ticket age or the renew age within the default ones or the ones used in the target domain. There are some detection tools. For example, the Microsoft's Advanced Threat Analytics also uses uh, detection mechanisms where if your maximum ticket age or the renew age is more than the domain policy, then there are increased chances of detection, right? So using correct options of mimickets, the offset options, etc., which allow you uh, to to provide these options of a ticket, that is generally recommended, right? Create a golden ticket or whatever ticket which complies with the domain policy, and your chances of detection of using that particular method would be less, right? Chances of detection less, chances of avoiding detection, that would be high. So this is about the domain policy. Now, once we know basic details about the domain, let's get some information about the domain controller. We can use getNet domain controller from PowerView or get AD domain controller from the Active Directory module. So let's run getNet domain controller. So what do we have here? Our OS version for the domain controller is Windows Server 2016 Data Center. Its IP address is 172.16.2.1, and that's its name. That's we already know, right? It is called dcorp DC. So this was getNet domain controller. Initially, we are having a look at both the commands. Later on, we are not going to do the same, right? This is just so that if you are comfortable with PowerView, you get to know the AD module. If you are comfortable with AD module, which mostly system administrators and blue teamers are, you get to know PowerView as well. So if you run get AD domain controller as expected, the results are quite the same. IPv4 address, there is no IPv6 address, that's the name, that is the operating system, right? This is the LDAP port, this is the LDAP SSL port, right? We can also get the domain controller information for another domain. For example, let's do it for moneycorp.local, right? Our parent domain. So if I run it for moneycorp.local, we get the details of the domain controller of moneycorp.local. It is 172.16.1.1. Once again, a server 2016 machine, a server 2016 data center, right? Now, once we have the basic detail about the domain and the domain controller, now let's get started and get some interesting information from the domain, right? Let's go after the users. So we can use getNet user from PowerView or get AD user from the Active Directory module. One thing which you may like to keep in mind here when using the Active Directory module, there are three important options which you can use with the Active Directory module. One is filter, which is the default filter. Right here we are passing a wildcard to it. That means we need to have a look at all the users. Then there is another option called properties, which as evident by the name, it controls the properties which you may like to have a look at. If we use properties asterisk, it lists all the properties of all the users in this case. If we do not specify dash properties, then it will list only the default properties. Another useful option when it comes to the AD module is the identity parameter. So either you can use a filter parameter, use a filter which retrieves information, let's say just about student one, or we can use the identity parameter. So these three parameters, filter, properties, and identity are common to many functions loaded by the Active Directory module. So make sure that you are familiar with these options, right? Let's run getNet user and getAD user first. So if I run getNet user here, I get a list of all the users with all the default properties in this particular domain, in our current domain. And if I run get AD user with a filter asterisk and I do not specify the properties parameter, I get a list of all the users in the domain only with the default properties. Right here, you can see that this is getNet user. Let's have a look at this one first. Let's go back to getAD user, and this time let's specify all the properties. Now you can see that this the output is much longer this time, much bigger. Okay, here we can always use, let's say you want to have a look at just the common name, right? Just one property from all of this. Let's say we want to have a look at just the CN or the common name. So we run select CN. These all are the users in our current domain, right? Let's do the same thing here. What is the property which we can use here? We can use name property here. So let's do it for the name property. So we select only the name property from all of this. So these are the names of the users in our current domain, right? Now we can do it for a particular user. Let's say if we run getNet user, username student1. So let's run this, getNet user, username, let's run it for student1. So that is student1. Similarly, we can do it with getAD user, identity, student1. So this is about student1. We can always use other options with this. For example, if you want to have a look at all the properties of student1 regardless of them being populated or not, you can use dash properties asterisk. So this is about basic enumeration of a student, now of a user. Now a user has a lot of interesting properties, right? So a user has a lot of interesting properties which we can enumerate for interesting results. For example, you may like to have a look at all the properties of a user in the current domain, right? So if we run, let's say, get user property here, so if we have a look at the list of user properties here, let me run this particular command. So what this command did, this command displays all the user properties, right? We can specify a particular user property, for example, password last set. Similarly, we can do the same thing with the Active Directory module. Now, what is the benefit of looking at user properties? There is a reason why I have selected or chosen password last set. Let's first have a look at this using the AD module. So these all are the properties. As you can see, get AD module is showing all the properties. Here we have not filtered out the null properties right now, so it shows all of them. We can do that with a simple filter, but that's not the point right now. What we are trying to do here is, let's filter out the password last set property. So what does this mean? What we are doing here? We are looking at the password last set of all the users in the domain. How is this helpful? There are many use cases of looking at user properties. Later on, during the defense part, when we touch deception, we'll get to know that is one of the most important usage other than looking at the passwords in clear text, which we will discuss in a moment. So the usefulness or the benefit of having a look at password last set, or there is another one, then I'll let you know why this is useful. For example, bad password count. So as you can see that a user which is actually used may have some bad password counts, right? For example, this user has a lot of bad password counts. Similarly, this particular user called test user has a lot of bad password counts. Same goes for a user called student 2. So what does this tell you when we talk about detection mechanisms? Deception is something, once again, which we will touch later in the defense part. Many organizations use uh, tools which are useful for detecting the careless attackers. That is, if you are directly going in for the lowest hanging fruit, where you do not uh, enumerate a domain properly. For example, you log on to, you get a foothold box and you start looking for a machine where a domain admin is logged in. You immediately get a machine, you try to use those credentials, and turns out that those credentials were not the correct ones, but were honeycrats or decoys, right? Similarly, an organization wants to target your enumeration phase of your attack. They would create some users which look very enticing, very useful, uh, but as soon as you interact or enumerate those users, there would be an alert and you may get detected. So properties like this, for example, password last set or bad password count, these properties can be used to differentiate an actual user from a decoy user, right? For example, a user for which password was last set few years back and has not been changed since may be a decoy. In fact, even more, a user whose bad password count is 0, in our case, because this is a new lab and many of these users are not actively used, we do not have a bad password count. But in a working actual domain environment or domain enterprise network, you will not have users which would not have bad password count. Actual users always fat finger their passwords. So if you find out users which do not have a bad password count, or similarly less logon count, that means those users may be decoys, right? So for example, if we have a look at the logon count here, I think the property name is logon count. You can see that the logon count is very small for many of these users, right? For many of them, it's 0, right? Sorry. What does this mean? That in an actual domain environment or in an actual enterprise network, any user with a logon count 0 or a small logon count means that either the user is not actively used or it is a decoy user. In both the cases, you have a category of users which you may like to either focus more on if you suspect that those are not decoy users but less used users, or you may like to actively avoid them if you identified that those are the decoy users. Now, how do we reliably identify a decoy? That we will cover later on, right? So this makes for a solid case for listing all the properties in the current domain. This was to duck or to avoid or dodging some deception-based detection. Now, there is another very interesting uh, option for this. Other than, once again, enumerating information like, let's say, email IDs, phone numbers, locations of users, there's one very interesting field which can be used to extract very interesting information. And no points for guessing it. It's the description field, right? How many times have you seen people writing clear text passwords in the description field of a shared user? I have seen it a lot of times, especially for shared users, let's say used by help desks, or for service accounts, that is domain accounts which are being used by services. I have seen many times these users would have their passwords because they have to change the passwords because of the domain policy. People tend to write passwords in the user description field so that uh, when there is a shift change or other users who share the password or who maintain a service which uses that particular user can have a look at the password. So we can use either find user field from Power View or get AD user to know or to extract description of users. One thing which you may like to notice here in case of PowerShell module, if you really want to know what goes in on the background, you may like to use PowerShell module. For example, here it looks more like magic. No hard feelings against Power View. It's a fantastic tool. But here, what you get to see is it looks a bit like magic that you use the function find user field, which looks in description for some search term. Here you get much more visibility of what you would like to what we'd like to see. Here, what we are doing is you're using get ad user and you want to list the property description for all those users whose description is or which matches or is like this particular string, right? So it makes you work a bit more, but provides you a bit more transparency of how a particular enumeration is being done. Once again, we are going to keep using both of the tools. Both have their own applications as we discussed in the beginning. So let's use find user field here. So as an example, we are simply looking for the search term called build in the description of all the users. We can always use any search term like password, username, expiry, or anything which we feel could be worth looking for. Now, if I run the other command in the Active Directory module, we get the same result, of course, right? So this way we can enumerate the description field of domain users. So that would be all for this particular video. In the next video, we'll keep discussing about the enumeration. Thank you very much for watching.